What we're going to do this evening is finish off the book of Shemot, because this week when we read Parshat Pekudei, it's the final Parsha, and when we complete this relatively short Parsha, we're going to say Chazak, Chazak, v'nid Chazek. We will strengthen ourselves looking forward to moving on to this third book of the Torah, which is the book of Vayikra. What I want to attempt to do tonight is cover 100 pages of the Parsha. I do want to say I have a new book by Rabbi David Foreman called On Exodus, and this is the last piece he has in the book, and it's based on creating a chiasm. Now, does anybody on this call know what a chiasm is? You can unmute yourself and feel free to speak. A chiasm is when you create a structure where there's a middle piece, and then it's mirrored on either side and on either side and on either side. So I'm going to share the screen now just to show you the structure so that no one in the middle of the class can just tunes out figuring that Rabbi Weiser definitely lost his mind on this one. So here's what I want to show you. We're going to look at a large portion of the book of Exodus, but I'm putting in the middle here the incident of the golden calf. And then we're going to see that mirrored on either side is a statement that begins with the word vayakel or vayikahel, the same word written but pronounced differently. And as we go out from this, we're going to see that the Torah talks about Shabbat on either side. We're going to see that the Torah has initially a command to build the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and on the other side of that, the actual building of the tabernacle. And then we're going to see on either end that there's an incident where the cloud of God is present in the world. Initially, it's going to be on Har Sinai, on Mount Sinai, and in the end, it's going to be filling in the Mishkan. So we're looking at a structural analysis of basically a little bit more than half of the book of Exodus. So I'm going to just follow it. If you can see the cursor, the golden calf is going to be our center point. And we're going to look at the phrases on either side, vayikahel or vayakel, Shabbat, Shabbat, command to build the tabernacle, the actual building of the tabernacle, the cloud of God covering Mount Sinai, and the cloud of God filling in the Mishkan. So this is what's called a chiasm. It has a name in Hebrew called Atbash, and Atbash is you take an aleph, the first letter of the alphabet, and a tuf, the last letter. You put them together. That's At, aleph, tuf. Take the second letter Bet, and the next letter in from the last Shin, Bash, and that's what it means going back and forth to create a center point. That's going to be the structure of tonight's class. And our first source is going to be on page 442 in the Art Scroll Stone Chumash, which is chapter 24, sentence 15. And we're going to conclude on page 540, right at the end of the book of Shemot. Just a few brief words of introduction, and hang in there. I don't want to lose anybody along the way. I think there's some interesting understandings here, and I think if you hold on to the structure, you can see many, many different implications that we're not really dealing with. The title, the traditional title of the second book of the Torah, Exodus, in Hebrew is Sefer HaGeula, a book of redemption. Redemption means we start out as slaves in Egypt, and we conclude in the wilderness, no place, but with a Mishkan in the center, and with the Jewish people camped around it, and with the clear, palpable cloud of God, presence of God residing right in the midst of the Jewish people. And that's the arc of redemption that the book of Shemot teaches us. Does not include going into the land of Israel. We won't discuss the implications of that right now, but an obvious implication is that the Jewish people ideally reside in the land of Israel. That's our homeland. However, we persevere and we achieve and we accomplish and we fulfill wherever in the world we happen to be. That's something we should all understand. Since none of us on this class at this moment are residing inside the land of Israel, it doesn't get us off the hook. Now, for tonight's discussion, because we're not beginning at the book at the beginning of Shemot and going to the end, we're starting our arc at Mount Sinai. We're going really through a trough of the sin of the golden calf, and then rebuilding back to this point of time where God's cloud of glory resides amongst the Jewish people. That's the arc that we're going to look at this evening. I'm going to pick a curious point to start at, and it's chapter 20, sentence 17, page 412. This is describing the experience of the Jewish people at Mount Sinai for the giving of the Torah. But I want to point something out to us. Let's begin on page 413. We'll read the English. Chapter 20, sentence 15. The entire people saw the thunder and the flames, the sound of the shofar, and the smoking mountain. The people saw and trembled and stood from afar. So the preparation for God speaking from atop Mount Sinai was so dramatic and so overwhelming that the Jewish people recoiled. Moshe said to the people, do not fear. They said to Moshe, the Jewish people said to Moshe, you speak to us and we shall hear. Let God not speak to us lest we die. Meaning they requested, Moshe, you screen God's address to the Jewish people by you listening to what God has to say, so to speak, standing between us and God and conveying it to us. Moshe said to the people, do not fear, for in order to elevate you as God come, so that the awe of him shall be upon your faces, so that you shall not sin. The people stood from afar, and Moshe approached the thick cloud where God was. And by tradition, here's the way we put these pieces together. The Jewish people were gathered at the foot of Mount Sinai. As God's presence thickened in the form of a cloud and fire and thunder and the sound of a shofar, the Jewish people were convinced that this is going to be too overwhelming an experience of revelation, and they won't survive it. And they request of Moshe to screen them. In the end, what Moshe, they make a accommodation, and the Jewish people heard by Jewish tradition directly from God the first two statements of the Ten Commandments. I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt, and you shall not have false gods before me. And then the remainder, they could perceive that God was speaking to Moshe, and they heard Moshe's voice repeating what God had to say, and that's how they heard the other 8 commandments. Now, what's curious about this? Why am I using this as an introduction? Because we see this idea of encountering God being perhaps overwhelming, too much for our systems to handle. After all, God is the creator. God is outside of creation. That's a definition of being a creator. We live within creation. So therefore, there are limitations in our opportunity to encounter God. This will bring us to the center point of the narrative we're going to discuss from the middle, and we're going to work our way out. Hang in there, it will make some more sense as we go along. The golden calf begins in the beginning of chapter 32. And if you want to follow along with me in the Stone Chumash, that's a great thing to do. We looked at it already a couple of weeks ago when we did this parsha, but it's page 492, 493. The people saw that Moshe had delayed in descending the mountain, and the people gathered around Aaron and said, rise up, make for us gods that go before us. For this man, Moshe, who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what became of him. Now, it's an interesting resonance here, just a connection I want to make in our minds. The people stood at Mount Sinai, and they thought this is too overwhelming an experience. They survived it. They waited 40 days and 40 nights to Moshe to return. And when they miscalculated the moment for Moshe to return, the logical conclusion of the people was he must have died. And we discussed this in detail a couple of weeks ago. There's Rashi quotes a Medrash. They saw a vision of a dead Moshe being carried in the heavens. So do you see how these ideas link together? The people said, look, we told Moshe it's too much for any person, any human being to survive in corporal life, maybe in some spiritual level, but to survive in physical life, an encounter with the divine. And now we're waiting for Moshe to come down. He's not coming down. Obviously, our assessment was right. And even Moshe couldn't handle it. So what's the conclusion we need to do? We need to create something to be a representation of God, because dealing with God directly is too overwhelming for us. And hence we get the sin of the golden calf. So I just want to center the center point in this week's Parsha in that context, okay? So the Jewish people are convinced that Moshe is never going to return. They panic, they feel lost, and they come to the logical conclusion in their way of thinking that Moshe is lost because of the overwhelming nature of directly interacting with God or God's presence, however you want to put it. And therefore, let's make something. Let's have a something which could stand between us and God and shield us from the overwhelming nature of encountering God. Okay, that's our center point. And from that, we're going to build out tonight's class, and we're going to go frontwards and backwards. And we'll do it step by step so as not to drive everybody crazy. Okay, and I'm going to share the screen again. And if sharing the screen is not working for you, please tell me. Sometimes it helps and sometimes it doesn't help. And right now it would help if I could see where I share the screen. Right. Okay. So we're right here in the middle, the sin of the golden calf. Let's work our way in both directions now. And the sin of the golden calf, we said, is on page 492. But here's where we're going to encounter, we're going to go backwards, and we're going to see the word vayikahel. The word vayikahel in this context, not vayakel, but vayikahel, means that people gathered around. It almost means they overwhelmed or they attacked Aaron. Okay, that's the first step of this. They were convinced that Moshe was gone, and they were stepping back from their rightful place vis-a-vis God. So if we're going to go to the other side of the golden calf, and we're going to encounter the word vayakhel, what do you think we're going to encounter? And we do that by looking at chapter 35:1, which is the first sentence right after the sin of the golden calf. And it is on page 516, chapter 35:1. We have here, and this is where we're up to, this vayakhel right there, vayakhel. It says, Moshe gathered, assembled the entire assembly of Israel and said to them, these are the things Hashem commanded us to do. On 6 days, work may be done, but the seventh day shall be holy for you, a day of complete rest for Hashem. It shall be Shabbat. Okay, so if we just look at this sequence right here in the middle, what do we see? We see a sense that the Jewish people despaired of seeing Moshe and despaired of living at a level of being able to encounter God. So when they come through that experience, and Moshe attains forgiveness for the Jewish people in chapters 32, 33, 34, the next thing on the agenda following it to repair this relationship becomes Shabbat. And the Jewish people are gathered, and they're gathered to talk about Shabbat, something that they talked about right before this happened also. And the Shabbat before is on page 490. So what we see here in terms of a structure from the Torah is an interesting thing. we see that the Jewish people were given instructions about Shabbat as a way of maintaining the experience of Sinai in their minds. But because of their reservation at Mount Sinai, it didn't hold, and they ended up gathering against Aaron, convinced that Moshe had been overwhelmed by his encounter with God. They built the calf. Now on the way out, Moshe gathers them together, and he again says the building block for rebuilding Jewish life is going to be Shabbos. Let's work our way out a little bit further. We had the command to build the tabernacle, which took place before this. It's on page 444. And again, you see what we're doing? We're taking the golden calf as a center point. We're working our way before and we're working our way after. But if we turn to page 444, what do we see here? We see the beginning of Parshat Truma, and we see God commanding the Jewish people to build a tabernacle. What's the idea of a tabernacle? The idea of the tabernacle was to make permanent an encounter with God. That's why even today, when we go to Jerusalem, when we go to Yerushalayim, we stand at the Kotel, the remnant of the temple, the place where God's presence was manifest in the world cumulatively for a period of more than 800 years, with an interruption in the middle of the first Golos, being kicked out of the land of Israel in the middle for 70 years. But the Jewish people had a place to make permanent their connection to God. So again, the instructions to build the Mishkan, if we take this chronologically as the Ramban does, means it was not enough to give permanence to their connection to God. So God introduced Shabbos to hold on to them. That also didn't hold up. They ended up massing against Aaron, and that's the trough point. And now as they're rebuilding, Moshe gathers them together in a positive way. He talks about Shabbos, and they actually start building with their hands, as we described last week, pouring their energies and their emotional impact into building an actual Mishkan to make permanent God's presence in the world. So that's how this is where this structure continues. And then to push out just a little bit further, and we're gonna look at some implications of this. If we go all the way back to page 442, which is just before the command to build the Mishkan, and we look at chapter 24, sentence 15, what do we find? We find a description as follows. Moshe ascended the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of Hashem rested upon Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for a 6-day period. God called Moshe on the 7th day from the midst of the cloud. The appearance and the glory of Moshe was like the appearance of the glory of Hashem was like a consuming fire on the mountaintop. Moshe arrived in the midst of the clouds and ascended into the mountain. Moshe was on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. That was the beginning experience of this being elevated from being a nation enslaved by Egypt to seeing the 10 plagues, to crossing the sea, to arriving at Mount Sinai and seeing Moshe ascend into a visible presence of God and ascend there safely. And how does the book of Shemot, this book of redemption, end? On page 540, if you look at the very end, it ends as follows. It ends very beautifully. I've always enjoyed the end of the book of Shemot, and it's on page 540. And it says here in sentence 34, the cloud, first we'll go back to sentence 33, 541 in English. He, Moshe, erected the courtyard all around the tabernacle and the altar, and he placed the curtain of the gate of the courtyard. Moshe completed the work. The sentence 34, the cloud covered the tent of meeting and the glory of Hashem filled the tabernacle. 35, Moshe could not enter the tent of meeting, for the cloud rested upon it, and the glory of Hashem filled the tabernacle. When the cloud was raised up from the tabernacle, the children of Israel would embark on their journeys. If the cloud did not rise up, they would not embark. For the cloud of Hashem would be on the tabernacle by day, and fire would be on it at night before the eyes of the house of Israel throughout their journeys. Chazak, Chazak, that concludes the book of Shemot. Let's, first of all, were you able to follow through these steps in terms of a structure that then we could have some discussion about? And also, does this raise any questions to anybody? You could put something in the chat if you like, or you could unmute yourself and ask a question if any of this was not clear. This is the structure which Rabbi Foreman creates and which we can build out of. Any questions, please? Okay. So I want to make an observation here. I want to connect something that's obvious here and apparent. As we get to the center point, we're talking about the Mishkan and Shabbat. And in classical Jewish thinking, the Mishkan itself is a sanctification of space, and Shabbat is a sanctification of time. And just a very clear contrast. How do we create a space for God? What creates a space? We build a home for Hashem. And we talked over the last few weeks how amazing it is to even think about people being able to construct a home for Hashem, which, if you think about it on a certain level, is reciprocal for God creating a home for us. God created the universe, sun and the moon and the stars, the earth. God even planted a specific garden of Eden for us to ideally live in, but we couldn't maintain that standard of living. So we spread out over the world with its challenges and its difficulties. But so we want to take space and dedicate space within God's world for God to live and reside. And we do that by building a Mishkan. We do that ultimately by building a temple. And we, the Jewish people, look forward to, again, having a home of God so that God's presence can be tangibly experienced by human beings within the creation that God placed us in. What is Shabbat about? Shabbat is time. The other dimension we live in is time. God doesn't live in time. Very, very difficult to understand ideas that there's no beginning, there's no middle, there's no end, there's no before, there's no after. When God's view of history, of events, of your life and my life, it's one, I can't even use the word continuum, and I don't know how to describe it. So how do we sanctify time? We sanctify time by not using it, by refraining from creative activity, by acknowledging the fact that time is also a gift, and we're not going to utilize this period of time, these 24 hours of Shabbat, as we utilize the rest of the time. It's going to be sanctified, it's going to be different, it's going to be holy. And hence, when the Torah talks about Shabbat, it says very beautifully, la'asot et Shabbat, that we make Shabbos. And we saw last week how the word vayas was used through the Torah from the conclusion of creation, where we said that God saw all that he had made, kol asher asa. We saw that when it came to building the Mishkan as vayas, they made the curtains, they made the walls, they made the table, they made the menorah, they made the aron, they assembled it. But it's just as much of a making and creating as for us to create a day like Shabbos and build it into the time that we live and to set it aside as a holy time. So we can see that on the way towards the golden calf, the Jewish people were despairing of the opportunity to have an encounter within God's creation with God. They demurred in the beginning at Mount Sinai, feeling it would be too intense. They knew that their challenge was to build the Mishkan, and we're going here according to the opinions that the commandment to build the Mishkan took place before the sin of the golden calf. So they knew that their challenge was to translate standing at Har Sinai into creating a home for God. They understood that they were given Shabbos, but they lost it all, this perspective, at the sin of the golden calf, because they said, and there's different understandings, but our understanding this evening is, aha, we knew all along it was too much for a human being to directly encounter God. We need an idol, we need an intermediary, we need something between, antithetical to Judaism. Because after all, what did God say at Mount Sinai? I am the Lord your God who took you out of bondage, out of Egypt, out of a house of slavery. I elevated you. I want to have closeness to you. I want to have a relationship with you. We can do this. We can connect with one another. You as the creation and me, God, as the creator. And in spite of all the huge gaps, and in spite of God's perfection and our imperfection, God's greatness and our lack of greatness, we can still connect directly. That's what the experience of Sinai was meant to bring into the world. The concept of building a Mishkan was meant to reinforce it within us, didn't work. The mitzvah of Shabbos was meant to give us an opportunity to not lose sight of that chance to connect with Hashem. Under duress, believing that Moshe died, we let it all go. And then the rest of the book of Shemot is rebuilding the spiritual psyche and the spiritual belief system of the Jewish people so that we could be gathered together properly. We could understand that there's Shabbat and we can sanctify time and make time to have a relationship with God, which becomes very, very real. We could actually, with our own hands, with proper intent and following God's instructions to a T, we could build a home for Hashem to rest in. And hence we get to the end of the Parsha. And what do we see? I just want to take note of this. What we see at the end was the presence of God resting within the Mishkan that we, the Jewish people, built was far more intense than the presence of God at Mount Sinai. Moshe was able to walk up the mountain, and he was able to enter the flames and the thunder and the lightning and the smoke and everything that was going on. And he was able to survive there as God taught him the whole Torah, because that's the essence of keeping the world on track. He survived all that, much to our disbelief. And we, through the gift of Shabbos, through the opportunity of creating spaces that are holy to us, a shul that we go to pray and encounter God. That's our equivalent. That's the best we can do right now. Ultimately, we look forward to the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem and seeing these miracles again. And as we recover our bearings and as we recreate and build upon this essence of Jewish life, we can look forward to a relationship with God, which is of the ultimate meaning and the ultimate intensity. The same Moshe who could walk up to the top of Mount Sinai could not enter the Mishkan the Jewish people built because of the intensity of God's presence. Of course, in the next book of the Torah, we'll see how God calls Moshe into the tent of meeting, into the Mishkan, so that he can teach him more Torah, and it becomes a meeting place for us human beings to encounter God to the ultimate extent, and to do so not at risk to our lives, although it takes reverence and respect when you go in there, but rather in fulfillment to the highest aspirations and to everything God created us for. And I think this is a great way and great structure, thanks to Rabbi Foreman, that we can conclude the book of Shemot. And if anyone has any questions, please, I'm happy to address them the best way I can. Please unmute yourself to ask whatever you would like. All right. Wish everybody well, and everyone should have a good evening. And I hope these ideas, give people something to chew on through, at least through Shabbos and through the time when we lift up the Torah, and you'll see that we've concluded book 2 of the 5 books of Moses. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
very-
Thank you. Peace cross. Thank you.
Thank you very much.